Good evening. As we begin, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we reside. We begin this evening then with a land acknowledgement. Due to COVID-19, many of us are spread far and wide in our virtual worlds. But we acknowledge that every one of us is sitting on stolen land, the land of indigenous communities. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to the original caretakers of this land. In the spirit of the Jesuit practice of composition of place, we acknowledge that Gonzaga University resides on the unceded ancestral lands of the interior Salish peoples, specifically the Spokane tribe of Indians, the people of the river, a people that are still here, continuing to honor and demonstrate that indigenous existence is resistance in the face of genocide and white supremacy. It is their ancestors who bring forth the power of this place, the knowledge that comes from the land. Wherever you may be sitting today, we encourage you to research the original peoples of your region. Learn the history, establish and maintain relationships with those people, the indigenous communities on whose land you reside, and support tribal sovereignty. This is one way to reject generations of systemic erasure and genocide and amplify indigenous voices. We are grateful to be on this land and ask for its support as we work to manifest our intentions during this gathering of hearts, minds, and spirits. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Brian Henning, who will offer a welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Henning. I am professor of philosophy and professor and chair of our environmental studies department. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for this great event. We're being hosted tonight by the Office of the Vice President of Mission and Ministry, the Environmental Studies Department, the Religious Studies Department, and the Catholic Studies Departments, all here at Gonzaga University. It's our great pleasure to host Father Horan in this great talk tonight. Before we begin, I would like to briefly take an opportunity to share with you a really exciting event that's taking place next week that relates to our time together tonight. On Earth Day, next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, Gonzaga is launching a new center, a new climate center called the Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. This project has been in the works for a long time. It's an academic university project that will help us to try to bring our academic mission, our time and talent as teachers and scholars, and the passion of our students to be of more service to the inland Northwest as we try and address the climate crisis. At the launch event at 3:30 Pacific time on April 22nd on Earth Day, we're going to have a panel that'll include Kea Chatterjee from the US Climate Action Network, our governor, Jay Inslee, Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, as well as many guest appearances from including our provincial from Jesuits West, Father Santa Rosa, and the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, Father Sosa. I hope that you'll take the opportunity to consider going to gonzaga.edu/climate center to learn more. Kevin might post for you in the chat the link to that. So it's again, gonzaga.edu/climate center. There you can register for the event. Even if you're not able to attend, if you'd like to register, then you'll be notified of a recording of the event and subsequent events that we'll be hosting. This gives you a sense, overview of the whole event. So I hope that you're able to join us for this new project. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. And so it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening. Father Daniel Horan is a Franciscan friar of the Holy Name Province, centered in New York, and a theologian who researches and teaches in the areas of constructive theology, spirituality, and the medieval Franciscan philosophical and theological tradition. He currently holds the Duns Scotus Chair of Spirituality and is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Spirituality at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. In addition to a dozen books, he is the author of more than 150 scholarly and popular articles and book chapters and leading international theological and pastoral publications. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, he is a regular contributor to the publication Give Us This Day and previously served as a columnist for America Magazine. Father Horan's most recent books are titled Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a Theological Anthropology, published by Orbis Press in 2019, which won the 2020 Best Theology Book Award from the Association of Catholic Publishers, and Reading, Praying, Living, Pope Francis's Rejoice and Be Glad, published by Liturgical Press in 2019, which won the 2020 First Place Book Award in Pastoral Ministry from the Catholic Press Association. His forthcoming books are titled Not Because of Sin, Reconsidering the Reason God Became Human, from Liturgical Press, The Way of the Franciscans, A Prayer Journey Through Lent, and Striving Toward Authenticity, Engaging Thomas Merton on Race, Justice, and Spirituality from Orbis Books. He is also editing the correspondence between Thomas Burton and Naomi Burton Stone for publication. Father Horan is a graduate of St. Bonaventure University, Washington Theological Union, and received his Ph.D. in systematic theology from Boston College, where I was fortunate enough to be one of his classmates and consider him a close friend. He currently serves on a number of academic boards and committees, including the Board of Trustees of St. Bonaventure University in New York and the Board of Regents of the Franciscan School of Theology in California. He is the recipient of numerous awards, honors, and distinctions, including awards for his writings, some of which I mentioned, and an honorary doctorate from Felician University in New Jersey in 2015. We had hoped to welcome Father Horan to campus last April, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are grateful that he is able to join us virtually and are grateful for his time this evening, as well as some time he spent with our students and faculty and staff this afternoon. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Father Horan for his presentation, Beyond Laudato Si, Embracing the Challenge of Franciscan Eco-Spirituality in the Age of Pope Francis.
Thank you so much. Let me begin with a note of thanks to Dr. Kevin Brown, as he mentioned, a classmate of mine from BC. Let me thank as well Vice President Michelle Wheatley and the whole team there at the Mission and Ministry office for the invitation to be with you, to Dr. Brian Henning and the co-sponsors, the Environmental Studies Department, Catholic Studies Program, and the like. It's been really delightful. My only regret, as Dr. Brown just said, is that I couldn't be there in person, but being there remotely with some students today and with some dear friends and some new friends in the various departments as I joined the faculty and staff this afternoon was truly a joy. So I'm delighted to be with you this evening, if remotely. So I do hope everyone can see the screen that I'm sharing here, and I look forward to sharing some reflections with you as we have some time as well for some discussion afterwards. It's well documented at this point that Pope Francis's election as Bishop of Rome in 2013 represents a number of significant firsts, including being the first Pope ordained after the Second Vatican Council, the first Pope from South America, the first Jesuit Pope, and the first Pope to take the name Francis. Among the many firsts that Pope Francis embodies, the last two I just named, his being the first Jesuit and the taking of the name Francis, have particular resonance for us this evening. As a Catholic university in the Ignatian tradition, Gonzaga is deeply committed to living out the spiritual charism established by Ignatius Loyola and carried forward not only by the members of the Society of Jesus, but by all those instructed but in and introduced to the tradition at various institutions around the globe, such as yours. I've been impressed by the Gonzaga community's efforts to embody the Ignatian tradition through mission integration and innovative projects, such as the very exciting development of your new climate center, which Dr. Henning just introduced, scheduled to launch next week, appropriately on Earth Day. And while the Ignatian tradition has so much to offer women and men of faith and all people of goodwill today, it's important to remember that it was not formed in a vacuum or created out of whole cloth by Ignatius in the 16th century. And this will all make sense in just a moment. Scholars like Boston College's Italian historian Franco Mormando and the late Fordham theologian Ewert Cousins have demonstrated the profound indebtedness the Ignatian tradition has to the Franciscan movement. In a 1984 article, Ewert Cousins explains that Franciscans and Jesuits share a common ground that provides the very foundations of their spiritualities. This common ground is devotion to the humanity of Christ, which in each case flowered in meditation on the life of Christ. He goes on and adds that both groups developed a Christocentric spirituality that looked back to the historical events of Christ's life as its point of departure. In this perspective, the Jesuits, Ewert Cousins says, can be seen to be heirs of a tradition that was originally developed by the Franciscans in the 13th century, which was transmitted to subsequent centuries largely through Franciscan channels. Although Franciscan in origin and transmission, he adds, this tradition so permeated the religious sensibility of Western Christianity that it became a dominant feature of European culture as a whole. More recently, Professor Mormando has shown how deep the Franciscan influence on Ignatius himself has been, from his earliest days in Spain through his vision for and establishment of the Society of Jesus. The profound indebtedness was reflected well in the title of a public lecture that Mormando delivered at Boston College 2 years ago, and one that I think caught the attention of many of his Jesuit colleagues. The title of his lecture, which you can find online, is Ignatius the Franciscan Roots of Jesuit Spirituality. Now, I opened my remarks this evening by highlighting this point about the Franciscan roots of the Ignatian tradition, not only because some of my Jesuit brothers tend to brush past or overlook this important historical context of their spiritual patrimony, you know who you are, but also, and more importantly, because it offers us another way to look at the curious event of the first Jesuit elected pope being the first pope to take the name Francis. Like most of the world, I was surprised to hear the name Francesco announced from the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square in 2013. The novelty of a new pontifical name sent shockwaves around the globe, with some Jesuits musing for a brief time that perhaps the erstwhile Cardinal Bergoglio had selected Francis after the Jesuit St. Francis Xavier. That was clarified quickly by members of the College of Cardinals and by Pope Francis himself in an address that he delivered to the media later in that week, during which he said that he chose to be called after St. Francis of Assisi, the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation, that same created world with which we do not have such a good relationship, he says. And he added, how I would like a church that is poor and that is for the poor, emphasizing the saint from Assisi's well-known affinity for and prioritization of the poor and marginalized. And that line, of course, is now so famous, and many of you, I'm sure, recall it. While the selection of a pontifical name has traditionally been viewed as offering a glimpse into a respective pope's spiritual outlook or ecclesiological agenda, I would be hard-pressed to think of another bishop of Rome that has modeled his papal ministry so closely after the inspiration of his namesake. In addition to his affable demeanor and refreshing pastoral informality, there is the magisterial contribution that Pope Francis has made during his ministry so far as Pope. Nowhere is this seen more clearly than in the motivation for and the content of his 2015 encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. Although his decision to release an encyclical just this past fall in October 2020 on the theme of Fraternitas, officially signed at the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi on October 4th, his feast day, might rightly win the prize for the most conspicuous alignment with his namesake. But I think it's fair to say that, so far, the sum total of Pope Francis's ministry and teachings bring the Franciscan Ignatian line of influence that Mormando and Cousins described into full circle. Laudato Si is a tremendously important document. Although Pope Francis is not the first pope to write on the themes of creation and environmental ethics, he is the first to focus an entire encyclical letter on the subject, noting the many important intersecting themes that affect both the human and the more than human worlds. steeped in the language of the Franciscan tradition, most famously seen in the title itself, which is taken from St. Francis's famous Canticle of the Creatures. Laudato Si draws on many of the resources of Franciscan theology and spirituality. But, as I intend to show, I think the encyclical still falls short of fully conveying the radicality of the Franciscan approach to creation and humanity's place within it. And I don't mean this as a critique of Laudato Si, as much as I believe it to be an opportunity for an invitation for us to rethink the meaning of the encyclical and our response to this teaching. Here's what I mean, and I'm thinking here of another Jesuit. To this end, I'm reminded of the late Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, and in particular his 1954 essay, Chalcedon, End or Beginning. It's a provocative title, at least for theologians. Rahner's question seeks to clarify the purpose of formal doctrinal statements. Are they the last word, the absolute and final expression about some aspect of our faith, for which nothing more can be said? Or are doctrinal expressions a beginning of the process of theology, the agenda setting, as it were, the first word that provides the faith in St. Anselm's famous description of theology as fides quorens intellectum, or faith seeking greater and greater understanding? Rahner used the affirmation of Christ's two natures at the Council of Chalcedon as a case study, but I believe the same kind of question ought to be posed to Laudato Si today, especially now that we're almost 6 years out from its promulgation. And if the answer to that question is that Laudato Si is indeed a beginning and not just simply the last word, then I believe the Franciscan tradition, particularly this sense of eco-spirituality, offers us key resources in seeking greater understanding about ourselves, about the rest of creation, and about God's relationship to the entire cosmos. So my presentation this evening, what remains with the time I have, is organized really into three parts before we have a discussion. The first, I want to offer a brief overview of the content and structure of Laudato Si, so that those who may not have had a chance to read the whole encyclical, don't worry, there will not be a quiz or an exam on this, so that at least everybody will have some familiarity with it. Next, I'll take up the question that Rahner first posed about Christology, and argue that Laudato Si is best understood today as a liminal text, an in-between document, which has one foot in what we might consider an inadequate understanding of humanity's place within the created order, while also holding one foot in the rich heritage of what I'm calling Franciscan eco-spirituality. And finally, I will close by highlighting the challenge and promise that the Franciscan tradition offers for our living and this inaugural vision of creation in Laudato Si, and how, in particular, in a context like a Jesuit university, it might be embraced and passed on to the next generation. So I am, however, just going to plug in my headset. I apologize for this, but I think the fan on my computer may be causing some interference. Maybe I can just have Kevin, can you hear me now? Is this coming through clearly?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay. So first, the teaching of Laudato Si itself, an overview. This is the whole 280 plus paragraphs on one screen. This is my favorite slide I think I've ever created. And I think those who are experts in pedagogy and teaching will be upset that it's all text and so much of it. But what we're looking at right here is the whole map of Laudato Si. And I just want to highlight, to kind of refresh for us, what's contained in this really rich document. And I begin by emphasizing the structure, the outline. Pope Francis begins by building on something Pope John the 23rd had first inaugurated, which is expanding the audience of an encyclical letter beyond just the Catholic Christian community, beyond bishops and priests and religious and baptized Catholics, to include all women and men of goodwill. And Pope Francis extends that even further. He doesn't qualify it by goodwill. He says this is for everybody who shares our common home. And the way I like to read between that line is that this is of such dire consequence that it's not reserved only for people who want to be on board, but rather Laudato Si is addressed to even those who might be malefactors, people who may be ill-interested or seeking to benefit themselves or cause some kind of problems. Anyone who's on this planet needs to pay attention. Pope Francis begins by asking the question, what is happening? And he draws on the latest science. He's very explicit about the current status of the environment, about our world, and says that such a reality, the effect of global climate change, is not up for debate. This is not something to question. It's clear, the consensus is evident among science and scientific experts. He then goes in chapter 2 to what he calls the gospel of creation, and offers a renewed sense of exegesis, looks at our Catholic Christian theology, spirituality, and philosophy, and draws from the best of scriptural interpretation, as well as underutilized theological resources. And here I have to give, unsurprisingly, a shout out to the frequency with which Franciscan figures appear, saints and theologians like St. Bonaventure, Francis of Assisi himself, and others, though he also cites Thomas Aquinas and other leading theologians and classical theological figures. In chapter 3, Pope Francis identifies the human roots of our current ecological crisis, and he emphasizes over and over again 3 key themes, 3 things we need to focus on. The first is anthropocentrism, this idea that in all of our decision-making and all of our activity and all of our behavior, both within the church and within broader society, our decisions tend to be guided by what serves our species first and foremost, almost to the exclusion of anything else. And furthermore, ourselves as individuals, whether it's our own clan, whether it's our own nation, whether it's our own community or family unit, whether it's our own selves individually, the self-centeredness has driven so much of our action, and the consequence has been devastating. The second thing he highlights, and this is another recurring theme in Pope Francis's writings and in his daily homilies, those who listen to him preach will recognize the theme of indifference. And he doesn't mean this in the way that Ignatius Loyola typically does in the spiritual exercises, indifferentia, this idea of remaining open to God's guidance in the direction of the Holy Spirit. Here he means it in the harsh sense of apathy, and points out that so much of the trouble that we face in the world today, and so much of the what he will call ecological sin that exists, as well as the intra-human sin, the way that we harm one another in society, is oftentimes not the result of people who are actively seeking to harm others. It's not people who are deliberately trying to cause environmental degradation or species extinction or deforestation. Instead, most of us just don't care. We don't care to recycle. We don't care to reduce our carbon footprint. We don't care about our shopping habits or the consequences of our decisions or of our national policies or international relations and so on. The lack of concern is really an acknowledgement of a sin of omission. And Pope Francis says that this is a major contributing factor in why there is such a responsibility placed on humanity for the crisis and crises we face today. And finally, the third theme there is technology. That technology in and of itself is neutral at best. And that one of the concerns that Pope Francis points out is that we have relied on technology with uncritical attention. In other words, if we look to the roots of our ecologic crises, as the historian Lynn White Jr. once described it, if we look at the Industrial Revolution, pollution, deforestation, and the effects currently of global climate change, part of that is a consequence of us not asking difficult questions about the ethics around technological development and its use. And furthermore, a lot of people today argue that the way we get out of these problems is by doubling down on our technology, by research and development. And Pope Francis says we cannot simply and blindly rely on technology because it is responsible in part for the circumstances we face today. Chapter 4, Pope Francis introduces the theme of integral ecology. It's a unifying vision. It's a claim that all of creation is united, that we are connected to one another. Here, he reiterates a phrase that was first popularized by the Brazilian theologian, Professor Leonardo Boff, a former Franciscan friar, who talked about the unity between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Here, he also draws on
the work of his predecessor, John Paul II, by highlighting what he calls intergenerational justice, that it's not just decisions we're making with regard to humanity and the more than human world today that we should be concerned about, what the immediate consequences are, but how is this going to impact and to affect future generations. The last two chapters, Pope Francis calls for action. He has a pragmatic call and says it's not enough for us simply to think about these things or to reflect upon them or to pray about them, as important as all of that is. We need to do something in response. And he calls as well for social and political engagement. And that can take a variety of forms. He doesn't specify, he leaves that open to everybody to discern in their own time and place. And he also calls for education and spirituality. And I like to think that the programs that are being introduced next week with the Climate Center at Gonzaga, this presentation, other initiatives that are underway at your university is exactly the living out of Chapter 6 as Pope Francis had envisioned it. How do we seek to educate ourselves and one another? How do we incorporate the reality of the challenges we face in the world around ecological concerns and challenges? How do we incorporate that into our faith life? So that is the whole sort of overview. And what I'd like to zero in on is this theme of anthropocentrism that Pope Francis names and that recurs in Laudato Si. And to talk about that a little bit more, I think it's necessary for us to zoom back for a minute, because I want to situate this encyclical within the broader context of the Christian tradition with regard to creation and humanity's place within it. Over the 2,000-year history of Christianity, there has been really three models, three paradigms or typologies for thinking about the created world and humanity's place within it. The first is known often as the dominion model. The second is oftentimes referred to as the stewardship model. And the third is called alternatively the kinship or community of creation model. Let me say a little bit about each first. The dominion model may sound familiar to many of you if you've read the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. There's a passage in chapter 1 that appears in which at verse 26 and verse 28, these instructions, these sort of mandates appear in which God is seen to have given to human beings, to humanity on the last day, Rada in Hebrew, the instruction to have, quote, dominion over the rest of creation, and to kabash, to subdue it. Now, scholars over the centuries and in more recent decades have tried to nuance how we understand that. Can we interpret this in other ways that are less violent, less overtly destructive, as the terms themselves seem at first glance? But in truth, according to this dominion model of creation, the way this has been interpreted is that God has given creation, the whole cosmos, this planet Earth, to us, that human beings have been entrusted with sovereignty over non-human creation to do with as we please. And therefore, we are seen to have the exhortation to have dominion is really an instruction for human beings to dominate non-human creation. It's very violent, it's very destructive, it's very disturbing, and it is not authentic to the Christian tradition, though it has been commonly interpreted this way and used to justify all sorts of harm against the more than human world. Scientists, historians, theologians, philosophers have pointed out problems with this over the generations, and certainly in our age of the Anthropocene, this age of the great sixth extinction, as some writers have described it, this has become all the more acute. Pope Francis, in paragraph 67 of Laudato Si, puts the end to this interpretation within the Catholic tradition. He says, and I'm just going to quote this last line here, is that what I've just described is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the Church. So in effect, Pope Francis takes the dominion model right off the table, that Catholic Christians cannot, in good faith, justify this perspective, that God has not made this world for our use as we see fit. This leaves two other options. One is the stewardship model, which has gained quite a bit of traction in recent decades in light of the awareness of the environmental degradation and the global crises we face. This perspective doesn't center just on Genesis 1, but looks to parts of Genesis 2 and 3, where it appears that God has entrusted God's creation to us, for us to be good stewards or caretakers, or gardeners in one context in Genesis, it appears, so that creation, the whole cosmos, this planet was not created for our use alone, but entrusted to us for our particular stewardship or good care. In other words, God owns this planet, as one psalm is oftentimes translated to suggest, and that within it, we live kind of as renters, right? Or as household managers for the divine. This is, in other words, in our Eastern Christian brothers and sisters have a strong sense of this kind of stewardship model, because they see humanity as playing a kind of priestly role, an intermediary role between ha'adamah, the dust of the earth out of which we are molded according to Genesis 2, and out of which all creatures are molded in Genesis 2, as well as, the divine. So we're sort of the middle women, the middle men between non-human creation and the creator. I should say that this is certainly an improvement on the dominion model. There's a lot of things that are positive here, especially the effort to think beyond pure subduing and domineering and domination, right? But there's a third tradition, and this is what I really want us to focus on in light of Laudato Si and the Franciscan tradition. And this is sometimes called the kinship model of creation. It's a small, I have to acknowledge it's not as widely known, a kind of minority tradition that understands our inherent relationality with all of creation. That we as human beings, in other words, it goes back to Genesis 2 and doesn't focus just on the stewardship approach, just on our being entrusted with a job. So that, true, without the dominion model, we're no longer the lords or ladies of creation. But the stewardship model seems to suggest that God has made us the landlords of creation, the middle managers for the divine. Meanwhile, the kinship model says, if you read closely Genesis 2, human beings are created, as the narrator points out, ha'adamah, from the dust of the earth. And if you read 7 verses later, God creates non-human animals exactly the same way, ha'adamah, from the earth, from the dust of the earth. And we are, to put it quite literally from the Hebrew, earthlings. We are made of creation. There's a saying that's oftentimes attributed to the popular scientist Carl Sagan, that we are made of literal star stuff or star dust, right? The elements that make up our very bodies and beings are the same elements that compose all of the material world of this universe, this ever-expanding universe. And this minority tradition of kinship was recognized throughout Christian history. It's present in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament. It's present in so many great mystics and spiritual leaders and figures, not the least of which is Francis of Assisi and the Franciscan tradition that follows him. Fast forward to the 20th and 21st century, there are theologians, philosophers, and other scholars who have caught up to what we'll see play out, I hope, this evening in terms of the Franciscan contribution. I'm reminded of Fordham University Professor Emerita, Sister Elizabeth Johnson, who said so well back in the 90s, if separation is not the ideal, but connection is, if dualism is not the ideal, but the relational embrace of diversity is, if hierarchy is not the ideal, but mutuality is, then the kinship model more closely approximates reality. And so it's my conviction that this kinship model of creation is ultimately where the Christian community should be going. That is our orientation. That is our trajectory. And Laudato Si helps us get there. But in my sense this evening, I want us to think about it as a bridge text, an in-between text, a liminal text. With the possible exception of Pope Paul VI encyclical letter Humanae Vitae in 1968, there have been not as many, very, very few, and maybe no more anticipated papal teaching in modern history than Pope Francis's Laudato Si. I know it's been tough and time has less meaning for many of us in the age of pandemic, but if we can think back to the before times, way back to 2015, to the late spring and early summer of 2015, when word began to trickle out of the Vatican that this document was coming, people were so excited and some people were already infuriated. The document was both loved and loathed even before its official publication. because of Pope Francis's clear, direct, and unapologetic admonition of human beings, and particularly those in the global north, those of us in places like the United States and in Western Europe. And he calls us out, and people knew this was coming, for our complicity in causing environmental degradation, as we saw outlined just a moment ago, thinking about the dominion model that has so kind of governed our way of being in the world for so long. Francis's text can be traced back now to this well-established stewardship model of creation. I think this is what is really at the core of this text. Though hailed for its novelty in terms of direct papal teaching on creation, I believe that Francis's operative theology is anything but new in terms of this stewardship approach, this middle approach. And I think it's a problem when it comes to understanding Laudato Si in terms of that end that Karl Rahner was talking about. If we treat this encyclical as the last word of the Catholic Church in terms of creation and humanity's place within it, then I think we're going to fall short of where God is calling us. Instead, I want us to think about it as a beginning for thinking about creation and humanity's place within it. As I mentioned earlier this evening, a lot of the language used throughout Laudato Si is drawn from the Franciscan sources. However, the theology that undergirds the overarching ethos of the text does not reflect the important and challenging theology of cosmic kinship expressed in the Franciscan theological and spiritual tradition. From the outset of Laudato Si, Pope Francis presupposes a theocentric vision of the cosmos, which is his way of moving out of that dominion into stewardship. He calls women and men of all backgrounds and of all faith traditions to return God to the rightful place as the source, the sustainer, and the goal of all of creation. With an allusion to the work of the Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin, Francis writes that the ultimate destiny of the universe is in the fullness of God, which has already been attained by the risen Christ, the measure of the maturity of all things, end quote. It's a beautiful line to reflect on during this Easter season in particular. The problem, Pope Francis explains, is that human beings have put themselves in God's place by adopting a distorted dominion model of creation, which has no place in Christianity, though it has held a center place for so long. Pope Francis directly addresses the need for us to decenter the human person within the collective cosmic framework, and he explains, a spirituality which forgets God as all-powerful and creator is not acceptable. That is how we end up worshiping earthly powers, or, and this line is key, worshiping ourselves, usurping the place of God, even to the point of claiming an unlimited right to trample God's creation underfoot. Is that not a good description of where we find ourselves today? He goes on, the best way to put men and women in their place, putting an end to their claim to absolute dominion over the earth, is once again to put forward the figure of God. God, as Pope Francis suggests here, as Father, or we might say God as Mother, the God creator who creates and who alone owns the world. Notice that stewardship language, God owns this planet. Otherwise, he says, human beings will always try to impose their own laws and interests on reality. Although Pope Francis plays down the language of ruler or sovereign in his various calls throughout Laudato Si for recentering God as the creator in our vision of the cosmos, right, decentering us, he nevertheless conforms to that stewardship model trope of God as owner of the universe, and that itself has problems because of its patriarchal sensibility. Meanwhile, human beings are surely not the lords and masters of the universe like in the dominion model. But God still remains the pater familias, right? The kind of head of the family of creation who has hired us, as it were, right? Stewards are hired hands, as opposed to members of one divine cosmic family. One of the most recognizable characteristics of the stewardship model of creation that we see throughout Laudato Si is the understanding that non-human creation, the earth in particular, is best understood as God's oikos for humanity, God's household. For heaven's sake, it's in the title of the encyclical, right? On care for our common home. Instances of this emphasis are really too numerous for me to name, and they're throughout the text. You can find it everywhere. But I want to highlight just a couple examples. Again, affirming this theocentric, God-centered vision of the cosmos, while also offering a repudiation of the dominion model we talked about. Pope Francis writes, and I quote, "We are not God. The earth was here before us and has been given to us. This allows us to respond to the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking on the basis of the Genesis account, which grants humanity dominion over the earth, has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by putting men and women as domineering and destructive by nature." And he goes on, that quote I mentioned earlier, "This is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the church," end quote. Pope Francis later cites John Paul II, in which we have a direct affirmation of this stewardship characteristic yet again. He says, "God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of its members." Again, this idea of instrumentalizing creation. The ownership of this oikos, the household, belongs to God. We might think of God again as the household owner, yet it has been entrusted to humankind for the purpose of a domicile and for our sustenance. What has been entrusted to humanity in terms of non-human creation is not reserved only for living, but also given by God for the living, but also given by God for future generations. That's that notion of intergenerational justice or solidarity. In concluding Laudato Si, Pope Francis offers an eschatological vision of the connection between our common home in this life and our future heavenly home, suggesting that we must care for this oikos while also affirming its source and purpose. He says, "In the meantime, we come together to take charge of this home which has been entrusted to us, knowing that all the good which exists here will be taken up into the heavenly feast." Now, Pope Francis offers a generally nuanced, if sometimes contradictory, presentation of what the British moral theologian David Clough calls human separatism. I think this is really important because it's an element of that stewardship model of creation. It's kind of a hangover from the dominion model, in fact. On the one hand, Pope Francis continually shines a light on our common connection and our interdependence on the rest of creation. Such is the case when he writes, for example, "Human beings too are creatures of this world, enjoying a right to life and happiness and endowed with unique dignity," end quote. Francis frequently goes out of his way to emphasize our relatedness to the rest of the creaturely world. However, on the other hand, Pope Francis doggedly defends the uniqueness and particular dignity of the human person, not in and of itself. That's fine. I'm not here tonight to suggest that human beings don't have inherent dignity and value. Absolutely. But how does he do it in Laudato Si? He oftentimes puts it in contrast to the rest of creation. And it's in those kinds of moments that we see that stewardship model of creation, this sense of human separatism surface throughout Laudato Si. Indeed, we may not be the lords and ladies, as I said, of creation. We may not understand ourselves as having absolute sovereignty over the rest of the world. However, we are still seen as middle people or outside or hired hands that do not have an inherent, connected, interrelated stake in the flourishing of all life, of all creation. We see this, for instance, in a section that Pope Francis titles "The Mystery of the Universe." Pope Francis writes, "Human beings, even if we postulate a process of evolution, also possess uniqueness, which cannot be fully explained by the evolution of other open systems. Each of us has his or her own personal identity and is capable of entering into dialogue with others and with God. Our capacity to reason, to develop arguments, to be inventive, to interpret reality, and to create art, along with other not yet discovered capacities, are signs of a uniqueness which transcends the spheres of physics and biology. The sheer novelty involved in the emergence of personal being within a material universe presupposes a direct action of God and a particular call to life and to relationship on the part of a thou who addresses God's self to another thou." So if we look at that, Pope Francis is very committed to this absolute uniqueness of humanity. And so on the one hand, right, this is with the liminality. There's one foot in this world of kinship, of we are creatures too. We are related and interrelated to the rest of creation. But as quickly as that is stated, there is a qualification here. Pope Francis relies on the typical loci frequently invoked to defend these kind of human separatist approaches to understanding the human person. And I think we see this most clearly in his preference for emphasizing, as I mentioned, the distinctiveness of the human person over admitting the commonalities or kinship we share with the rest of the created world. These loci include the commonplace notions of subjectivity, rationality, creativity, artistry, imagination, interpretation, moral reasoning, and so forth. This is understood as being, from Pope Francis's perspective and from the stewardship model, applying only to human creatures. Implicit in the discussion of humanity's unique relationship with God is an affirmation of the human person as inherently religious, which remains another category used to explain the kind of human separatist characteristic of the stewardship model of creation. It's true that Francis oscillates between a focus on the interrelatedness of all material creation, including us, and the distinctiveness of the human person as such. However, as I mentioned already, he often qualifies the former vision of humanity within creation in order to affirm the latter vision of our uniqueness arising from our singular status as imago Dei. Finally, the whole tenor of Laudato Si reflects a deontological sense of the human vocation as steward of creation. And I think this is really important. It seems to invest in us a vocation that has a clear end. It's an end that's duty-driven, that's motivated from without. Drawing on John Paul II's own reiteration of the duty of all Christians to care for creation, Pope Francis expands the demographic of this vocational characteristic to all people. He writes, "If the simple fact of being human moves people to care for the environment of which they are a part, Christians in their turn realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty toward nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. It is good for humanity and the world at large when we believers better recognize the ecological commitments which stem from our convictions." These convictions about which Pope Francis speaks are grounded in what he calls the correct interpretation of Scripture. And it's in this, again, returning to this interpretation of Scripture, he suggests that God has intended human beings to be gardeners and stewards of creation from the beginning. He writes, and this appears in paragraph 67, 68, he says, "The biblical texts are to be read in their context with an appropriate hermeneutic." So far, so good. He says, recognizing that the scriptures tell us to till and keep the garden of the world. Tilling refers to cultivating, plowing, or working, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This implies a relationship of responsibility between human beings and nature. Each community can take from the bounty of the earth whatever it needs for subsistence, but it also has the duty to protect the earth and to ensure its fruitfulness for coming generations. This responsibility for God's earth means that human beings endowed with, again, intelligence, right, that distinctive characteristic, must respect the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between the creatures of this world. As with his previous pontifical predecessors, Francis's key concern is for shifts in human praxis, right? How do we relate to creation differently, arising from a sense of our divine vocation in the response to the environmental degradation around us? Throughout Laudato Si, we read about our human responsibility for nature over and over again. This responsibility, as I mentioned, alternatively described in terms of gardening metaphors, is tied explicitly to the notion of responsible stewardship. And as I mentioned earlier, stewardship is certainly an improvement over dominion. And it's a phrase, it's a paradigm, it's a model of creation that is widely embraced across many different traditions. Francis connects this responsible steward trope to ecological conversion, but in a way that still evokes a human separatism. He says that we hopefully can live into this vocation. And in paragraph number 205, Pope Francis says, "Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good and making a new start despite their mental and social conditioning. We are able to take an honest look at ourselves, to acknowledge our deep dissatisfaction, and to embark on new paths to authentic freedom." I think that line is really important, the spirit of ecological conversion. And I believe that part of that ecological conversion is recognizing the liminality of Laudato Si. For as significant as Laudato Si has been in centering the importance of discussions about creation and humanity's place within it for the church and for the world today, I really do believe that it's best understood in this liminal sense as a teaching document that recapitulates the contemporary consensus of a stewardship approach to humanity's place within creation that also points us forward toward the work that remains to be done. And in this way, Rahner's question about the doctrinal statements of the church being an end or a beginning applies here. And our answer ought to be, Laudato Si is the beginning of the theological and spiritual work necessary to ground constructive ecological praxis. Specifically, I believe the content and vision of Laudato Si, particularly with its origins being associated with the Franciscan tradition, spiritual and theological inspiration, that it contains an inherent dynamism that points toward a fuller recognition and embrace of this kinship or community of creation paradigm. So in the last section of my presentation now, I want to highlight some of the ways that the Franciscan theological and eco-spiritual tradition can challenge us to constructively receive and move beyond Laudato Si in precisely this manner. So first, to many people, the choice of St. Francis of Assisi as the inspiration for an encyclical on creation is a no-brainer, right? How many of you who have pets at home take your animal companions to the church or to the chapel or to campus ministry on October 3rd or October 4th for a blessing, right? On the feast of St. Francis. St. Francis is recognized the world over as an icon for care for creation and love of animals. In fact, in the 1990s, it was John Paul II who named St. Francis the patron saint of ecology, just to make it official. And while all this attention to St. Francis's profound respect for and connection with all of creation is laudable, an unfortunate consequence has also arisen over the centuries and indeed in recent decades. What I'm talking about is what I call the Birdbath industrial complex. What I mean is that so much attention, almost always positive, I should say, is given to St. Francis as the patron saint of ecology, that he and his profound spiritual vision can be too often reduced to a cartoon or a caricature. I mean, for heaven's sake, just look at some of these statues here, right? What is lost then is the radical nature of St. Francis of Assisi's theology of creation and eco-spirituality. Francis intuited what later theologians, biblical scholars, and even many natural scientists would describe as the kinship model of creation. Francis did not merely look out at a beautiful landscape or a striking sunset and proclaim gratitude to God for these things that had been given to him. And I think that's the way a lot of us, even with the best stewardship lens, still look at the rest of the world, the non-human world. Oh, when we do acknowledge it and we are grateful for it, we're grateful to God for the gift to us. Again, an anthropocentrism. Instead, as Professor Ilia Delio, a Franciscan theologian, puts it, Francis felt himself part of the family of creation. He took spontaneous joy in the material world. He sang its praises like a troubadour poet with a disarming sense of immediacy. He recognized what we might call the divine DNA that links him to the rest of the created world. Why? Because he was, just as we are, part of that family. St. Francis's vision was prophetic, not because he's able to predict the future in some magical way, but because he was able to see the world as it actually is, according to God's vision for creation and human society. And I think this is most clearly seen in his famous Canticle of the Creatures. I think too often people reduce the Canticle, as famous as it is, to a kind of romantic or cartoonish or caricature of what's really being conveyed there. Most people are familiar with it from one of two hymn versions, All Creatures of Our God and King, which is kind of this German anthem that you might be familiar with, played loudly on the organ. It's fun to sing. Or Marty Haugen's more contemporary, the Canticle of the Sun, the heavens are telling the glory of God. What's interesting about both of those famous English language versions of the Canticle is that neither of them include the fraternal and sororal titles that Francis deliberately places on non-human elements of creation: brother sun, sister moon, sister water, mother earth. There is the familial connection linguistically. But furthermore, the way that the sentences are constructed in the kind of nascent Umbrian dialect of Italian, the preposition per appears in each of those lines. And it's not praise be you, my Lord, for these things that you've given me. It's praised are you, Lord, through these things that are doing X, Y, or Z. It's a reflection of some degree of agency and independent relationship that the rest of creation has with the Creator. And Francis wasn't the first to come up with this. Those familiar with the book of the prophet Daniel will know of the famous litany in which all of creation is exhorted to bless the Lord, to praise the Lord. Those of you who pray the divine office know that that's Sunday morning, week 1, the canticle, right? It's the second psalm, the second canticle that we pray. That there's this sense of agency, and it's not just romantic, it's not just idyllic, it is real. Francis recognized that the rest of creation did not need human beings to be intermediaries with the Creator. God loved each aspect of creation into existence just as God had loved each of us. God knows each aspect of creation. And furthermore, the canticle seems to suggest that we human beings, as Francis of Assisi says in verse 2 of the canticle, are not worthy to utter God's name. He says that, introduces us, and then moves on to the rest of creation. We reappear at the end in the later edition of Francis's, in which we are reflecting how God intends us, in Francis's eyes, to be most fully human. How do human beings give praise to God? Since the sun gives praise to God by shining rays and providing warmth and providing the day, and Mother Earth gives praise to God by being our shared domicile and home and providing greenery and herbs and all sorts of life, human beings give praise to God by being lovers and reconcilers and peacemakers. We fail to give praise to God because we are, in Francis's estimation, the creature most likely to try to be something other than what God has called us to be. And therefore, the canticle of the creatures portrays a profound vision. It was and remains a deeply profound reflection on the reality as it is, expressing a mystical insight about humans and non-human creatures. Francis's way of living in the world, as I say here on the slide, was one of intimate relationship in which he lived with the world, with non-human creation, and not above and against it, as so many others do, even well-meaning people, according to the stewardship approach. The kinship vision of creation wasn't just expressed in the Canticle of the Creatures. We don't have time for me to get into all the other areas, all the many writings and stories collected about him from those who knew him, but it's present throughout the tradition. As the late British theologian Eric Doyle noted, nature for Francis was not just a reflection of human activity and reactions. It wasn't just a projection of, oh, that creature, that dog, that cat, that raccoon seems very human-like. It's not a reflection of us because, as Doyle says, this would have been to destroy the unique value of other creatures. They're not just inadequate versions of us or Pache Teilhard de Chardin. They were not just further behind us on the evolutionary trajectory toward more full actualization as humans. Doyle says, drawing from Francis's vision, that they, the rest of creation, are not mirrors of us, but like us, they reflect God. This last line in the quote from Eric Doyle points to one of the useful Franciscan insights, I think, that can challenge us to move beyond Laudato Si to more fully embrace this kinship model of creation that we see represented in Francis's vision. And I think this comes best to us from some insights of St. Bonaventure, a 13th century theologian, philosopher, professor at the University of Paris. He was minister general of the Franciscan order, was later made a bishop, a cardinal, and is a doctor of the church. I'm oversimplifying here for the sake of time, but two little elements. Bonaventure was able to systematize and theologize that spiritual, that eco-spiritual insight and intuition of Francis of Assisi. And one of his many contributions is to emphasize that all creation, every creature, human and non-human alike, are, in his eyes, created by God as vestiges and mirrors. I have a little image of a foot here, a clip art of a foot, because in Latin, the word vestigium means footprint or imprint. We think of vestige in an adjectival form oftentimes. We think of like the human appendix as a vestigial organ. It's left behind. And in that spirit, a vestige is something that contains a remnant of what was once there. In this case, Bonaventure says that all of creation bears an imprint, a footprint, a fingerprint of the Creator. That each of us, loved into existence, created by God, it has that great image of Genesis 2 of God creating humanity, ha'adamah, from the dust of the earth. Or as we see in the prophetic literature, such as in the book of the prophet Isaiah or in Jeremiah, this idea that God is like a potter who molds us. The thing about art, as some of you who are artists know far better than I do, is that you can see, even if the artist is not conscious of this, brushstrokes or finger marks or imprints that exist in various kinds of visual art. And that points to the artist, right? When you look at the artwork, you can see the reflection of the artist, and that's where the mirror comes in. Each of us, all of creation, has this imprint of the divine, but if we can train our eyes to see it, all of creation reflects not us back to ourselves, as Doyle said, but Bonaventure believed that all of creation reflects the Trinity, reflects this vestige, reflects the Creator back to us. There are other elements of Bonaventure's insight that further develop this intuition of a kinship model of creation. He talks about the principium creativum, this idea of all of creation comes from a single divine source. It's an emanation, it flows from God. The way I oftentimes talk about this is there are two categories in existence. There's God and there's not God. So we're either God or we're not. And guess what side we are? We're on the not God side. And so because of this, Bonaventure asserts that every creature bears an inherent relationship to all else in creation because we come from the single divine source, the Creator. We have one source. It's not like God created the earth and then something else created us. Or as the Neoplatonics would have it, that God created, the non-material world and some demiurge, right? Some lesser God or evil God created the material world. That is a heresy. That's Gnostic. Instead, God's act of creation establishes a sense of harmony and order within this creation, this harmony and order that God intends us to live, that's conveyed, of course, in Francis's beautiful Canticle of the Creatures, or in Daniel's canticle, in which all of creation in one voice and harmony is giving praise to God, and they do so by being and living out the vocation God has called us to. Again, I point to Sister Ilya, who says, the beauty, order, and harmony of creation signified to Bonaventure that this created world is not simply a stage for human activity or a backdrop to human longings, but that the whole of creation has meaning and has purpose. While St. Francis and Bonaventure offer us a spiritual and theological vision of the created world and humanity's place within it as God intended it, there are some who might wonder how the life of the kinship model of creation can be lived out practically. And to this end, I want to turn to the insights of another 13th century Franciscan theologian, one who I bet most of you have never heard of, so we're going to give him a little bit of a shout out here, and that is Peter of John O'Leary. He offered a constructive theological response to what might seem to many of us today like an arcane medieval debate about consecrated religious life. There was a debate in the 13th century over the Franciscan vow of poverty, about evangelical poverty. And what does it mean to actually live the vow of poverty? Now, technically, the Franciscans, like myself, we profess a vow in Latin, sine proprio, to live without anything of our own. But Peter, O'Leary had this idea that, people were taking advantage of this. So to put it in modern context, it'd be like if I were driving around, in a Mercedes Benz, somebody, let's say, had bought it and given it to me. O'Leary would have some real serious questions about this, because he would say, well, on the one hand, yeah, you legally, juridically, you don't own it, right? It's not yours. The title is not in my name. It belongs to somebody else. But his question is, what relationship does your use of things have to this vow to live without anything of your own, to live more Christ-like, more like the gospel? And so he comes up with this term, usus pauper in Latin. It means literally poor use, but it's better translated as like restricted or discerning use. I really see this as being something too that aligns well with the Ignatian tradition of discernment. In several places, he highlights this. He's like, it's not enough to just say that you can use whatever you want as long as you don't technically own it. there needs to be more discernment here. So he says in one of his writings, one can deduce what we mean by usus pauper, namely that usage which, all things considered, is fitting for the evangelical poor and mendicant, and there can be diverse grades that is fitting, more fitting, most fitting. In other words, it's not clear cut all the time. It requires, again, discernment, reflection, attentiveness, mindfulness. In another one of his treatises, he says, usus pauper is that use which, all circumstances considered, is more consonant with the poverty and condition of Christ than with the condition of the rich. So applying usus pauper to that Mercedes-Benz again, this would not hold up to the task, right? It's hard to imagine Jesus of Nazareth alive in 2021, driving around, zipping around Spokane in a Mercedes. That would be something more along the lines of the condition of the rich, according to Olevi. So what does this have to do with creation? Why am I bringing up this weird thing? A, to make sure everybody's still awake, everybody's still following me, but B, because I believe that it provides us with a curious way, an interesting principle to help us negotiate a really problematic tension that we face as Christians, as people committed to Laudato Si's vision and the desire to move beyond that in constructive ways. The issue is the tension that exists as a result of the defense of God's creatures having intrinsic dignity and value, that every one of the creatures in the cosmos is loved into existence by God, has an inherent relationship to God, not the same as you and I might have, but its own, relative to its own identity, its own sort of existence. That's one truth. And another truth is that we have everyday necessity or need for instrumental use of some aspects of creation. No living being on this planet can survive on its own. Neither you nor me nor any octopus or whale or mosquito. We all have to consume other creatures, former living creatures rather, to live, to clothe ourselves, to house ourselves, right? And so how do we negotiate this? Well, because all creatures require the use of other creatures for survival, I think Olevi's insight is especially helpful in thinking about normative attitudes or habits that human species, that we as a human community form around how we instrumentalize or how we utilize other creatures. And this has really practical consequences. Usus pauper is a way of thinking about discernment around how we shop, when we and where we dine out, what our clothing choices are, our policies around things like factory farming or treatment of what we might call livestock or other creatures, the use of plastics in so-called disposable goods, our meat consumption, our energy use, our travel choices, and on and on. Nearly all of these things are unavoidable in some sense, right? They're necessary. The question then is, how do we discern between the right use, the poor use, the restricted use, the discerning use, and just uncritical kind of sovereign dominion use of non-human creation? The last thing I want to highlight brings us back to St. Bonaventure, and this is kind of an overarching invitation, kind of a meta thought about moving from stewardship to kinship, and that is this ancient Roman virtue of pietas. Bonaventure writes about pietas a lot. Now, many of us think about the English word piety, and we might think of people who are particularly devoted to prayer or going to daily mass or praying the rosary. We say, oh, that's a pious person, or that person has great piety. But in its origins, the word piety, pietas, dates back to ancient Roman civilization. In the Latin itself was a key virtue, a social virtue, a familial virtue. In the Roman context, pietas was understood in filial terms, family terms, relating to the care of one's parents, to one's siblings, to one's family members, not out of external duty or obligation or job, right? Like a steward or a gardener or a landlord, but because of one's kin relationship, because of one's inherent identity as a member of the same family. This also extends, as we see, to other family members beyond one's parents, to one's deceased loved ones, right? As well as to deities, right? It's funny, that last inflection in the Roman tradition is what we, in modern kind of religious discourse, prioritize as piety. Francis of Assisi is the exemplar of pietas with all of creation. This was Bonaventure's contention. And if I had more time, I tell you some stories. There's some great stories Bonaventure tells in his writings about St. Francis to demonstrate his pietas. And it's within the context of the created world. But the rest of creation also recognized this characteristic in Francis. That's what's so insightful about Bonaventure. Bonaventure says, and here's just one example. He says, let also the devotion of the faithful, you and I, weigh how the piety, the pietas in God's servant Francis was of such marvelous power and of such abundant sweetness that even the nature of animals acknowledged it in their own way. I really love this line. I love the stories too. So I encourage you to check them out in Bonaventure's Life of St. Francis. It's called the Legenda Major, the Major Life of St. Francis. But there are great stories of the reciprocity of pietas. I think a lot of us have these popular images, sometimes formed by that Birdbath industrial complex, of a Francis of Assisi, like this picture here, this painting, kind of petting a deer or having birds come to him or preaching to the birds or taming a wolf or what have you. And as lovely as those images are, what they don't convey is that there is this mutual understanding, a recognition in their own context, right? As best a wolf can or as a bird can, and as best we as human beings can, of our inherent interdependence and interrelatedness. The air we breathe is the same. The makeup cosmically of our bodies are conformed of the same elements. We share one, as it were, divine DNA because we come from one common source, as St. Bonaventure says. Care for creation, according to this virtue of pietas, this way of thinking, what we need to cultivate, this ecological conversion, is to a renewal of our own family ties to all of creation. It's not something, therefore, we do out of obligation, duty, or command, or job description. We're not meant to be good stewards. Stewards could be good or bad, or fired, or hired, or renewed, and what have you. We're not contract workers for God. We're part of a family. Now, you can be a good family member or a bad family member, an abusive family member or a generative supportive family member. And quite frankly, we in our human species have been very bad, very abusive members of the family of creation. What are we called to in ecological conversion? We're called to this pietas. We do it as fellow family members. We care for creation. We care for what Pope Francis calls our common home because we're intimately tied to it as part of it. And as I often like to reflect and challenge myself and invite you to do the same, the rest of creation is already caring for us. Take a deep breath right now. And think about where that oxygen came from. The plant life, the algae, the wind that circulates it. Everything that makes it possible for us to live is occasioned not by our own acts, not by something from without, but because we are interdependent. We are sisters and brothers with the rest of creation. What do we do in turn? So the question is really a question of how are we to live? How are we called to live? What are we going to do in response and in the effort of this ecological conversion? In closing, I would suggest that the key takeaway I hope to leave you with this evening is that while Laudato Si, this encyclical letter, is a monumental teaching, it summarizes so much of our Christian tradition and puts forward an important corrective vision to our rampant anthropocentrism over time and still latent even today, even in a great document like Laudato Si. However, there's still much work we need to do. The work is not finished. I believe that ultimately Laudato Si, as I said, is a liminal text. It's a great bridge from our myopic anthropocentric past toward a deeper embrace of the vision of creation God has revealed through scripture, through history, and even through natural science. The Franciscan tradition, I believe, offers a constructive challenge from within our Catholic Christian context that bolsters such a vision. And it prompts all of us, especially those invested in and shaped by and loving the Ignatian tradition at a place like Gonzaga. It drives us, prompts us onward to being not mere stewards or hired hands of creation, but authentic sisters and brothers and siblings within the cosmic family God has loved into existence. So I thank you all for your attention. I know that was a bit long, but I look forward in our time remaining to our discussion and questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Father Horan, for that really wonderful and clear and moving presentation. We've had a couple questions come into the chat or into the Q&A already, and we have about 15 minutes. We're gonna put a hard stop at the top of the hour, so everyone in their various time zones. And I should note, we have people tuning in from literally all over the world this evening for me, the morning for some of you who have already said good morning from the Philippines in the chat. So we want to thank you for being with us. And so I've grouped some questions together that have already come in. And the first group of questions has to do with whether, even if people agree with a preference for a kinship model, and some of them do and some of them don't in this group of questions, is whether something of the dominion and the stewardship models can be recovered. So one questioner asked, the creatures are also told to be fruitful and multiplied. Dominion can't take away that blessing. So wouldn't there be some need to attend to the flourishing of other creatures built into the dominion model as well? And another person asks, I wonder if we can also consider dominion and stewardship as fruitful. Taking ownership of one's dome or domicile can lead to responsibility for one's community in relationship with creation.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I will say that there has been, and there continues to be, scholars, biblical scholars in particular, but theologians and ethicists and others who have tried to, as the one questioner put it, kind of rehabilitate, in my word, I guess what I would use, these earlier models. They're logically earlier, but they're concurrent, right? There's always been a dominion interpretation. There's always been a stewardship interpretation. There's always been a kinship interpretation over 2,000 years. It's just that the kinship model has been sort of the minoritized of the three. Dominion, especially from the Renaissance through the Industrial Revolution, really gained the most traction, and we see clearly why, especially with the Industrial Revolution. And I think it's only now in the 20th and 21st centuries that kinship is getting more attention, though as we see in the 13th century, as we see in sacred scripture, it's been present all along. I'm somewhat sympathetic. I mean, I'm just going to be honest, since the question is about my opinion. I'm somewhat sympathetic to the scholars who want to recover and retrieve dominion and stewardship. I mean, I think Pope Francis has, pun intended with the Hebrew, put the kibosh on, has subdued, as it were, the dominion model. I mean, he makes that clear in Genesis 67. So I don't really see what the value is in returning to that. Some will then say, and I imagine this is what's motivating some of the questioners' thought, well, then what do we do with Genesis 1:26-28? We have this text from the Bible, how do we deal with this? Well, there are a lot of texts in the Bible that are quite problematic. The great feminist biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble wrote a powerful book about texts of terror and how we are to interpret these texts. Some things cannot be totally salvaged. That's okay in my eyes, because Genesis 2 and actually certain readings of Genesis 1, not all of Genesis 1 is dependent on subduing and dominating. But the stewardship model has a lot of positive things going for it that are worth retrieving. The biggest one being that it's the kind of common, it's the lingua franca of environmental justice today. So regardless of your religious tradition, or even if you're from a secular community interested in care for creation, stewardship is nomenclature everybody can pick up. Everybody knows what we're talking about. So I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. And that's why I think Pope Francis in particular, Laudato Si, keeps falling back on it, right? It's a common language. And even that is asking a lot for people who would rather, because of the anthropocentrism, the kind of self-centered interest, either of for financial reasons, capitalism, or for just selfish reasons of apathy. I don't really care about recycling or polluting or plastic use. I'm going to do what I want. It's my life, this sort of, kind of American rugged individualism. So I think stewardship's an improvement on that. I still would say that I think if we look at the intersection of what natural science shows to us and what sacred scripture has presented to us, but that we have only looked through for a large portion of Christian history through anthropocentric lenses, and we look to traditions like that of the Franciscan tradition, I think, as Professor Elizabeth Johnson says, the kinship model is the best. I mean, not that this is a contest about better or worse, first place, second place, best in the sense that it most accurately reflects what we as Christians believe about God's vision for creation and humanity's place within it. And I could go on. There are lots of like implications of that, lots of consequences. But I think that's where I would start. So I really do appreciate those questions. They're worth thinking about. And as long as people continue to, operate with these paradigms, then there will need to be nuancing. There will need to be these ongoing conversations with folks who embrace a dominion approach or a stewardship approach.
Great. Thank you very much for that helpful answer. I just want to note that I'm going to do my best to pull all the questions together so we can get to all of them. But if we don't, we do apologize in advance if we don't get to the specific question you asked. This is a set of questions that has to do a bit with the implications of kinship, or the implications also of a critique then of dominion and stewardship model. So one of our participants asks, if you see an influence of the dominion model and the stewardship model on capitalism as it exists today, and how the kinship model would challenge today's dominant economic system that extends even into the corporate space race, and how kinship might extend sort of extraterrestrially into the moon and outer space. And then a second sort of implication question is someone who's working on a dissertation on a kinship model in relation to Laudato Si and the idea of deep incarnation, and calls for a qualified vegetarianism as a habitus, toward which all Christians ought to be directed, and whether you see what your thoughts are on the pastoral possibility of directing all Christians to discern a shift towards vegetarianism.
Oh, wow. Okay. Two excellent and rich questions, two trajectories. I think the first one's shorter for me to answer, which is absolutely the connections to capitalism. I mean, I think you heard me throughout this evening talk about the overt ties between the dominion model in particular and the Industrial Revolution. If I may be so crass, I'll say, if you want to read more, you can look at All God's Creatures, my book on theology of creation. All joking aside, I point to that because there's a significant chunk in chapter 1 where I explain the history of that. And so I think it brings to light exactly this question. And I like how the questioner, our participant, kind of projects that onto where we're going in terms of a lot of the discourse today about space exploration. And it's so interesting. I really do appreciate this question because the language around it is about, what is it about? It's not about space exploration for its own sake. It's not about learning about the cosmos for its own sake, though there are, I'm sure, astrophysicists and scientists and others who truly are motivated by that. But where does the money come from? Back to capitalism. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all these other, the owner of Virgin Airlines and so forth. These folks who are billionaires who are, doing the private space race. It's all about human-centeredness. It's all about creating a colony. It's about mining resources. It's about finding a plan B if we ultimately destroy planet Earth. And by the way, there is no planet B, no plan B for us, right? So absolutely, I think they are totally tied together. And I think it was implied in the questioner's framing. I think the kinship model or the community of creation model, which I think, again, reflects a truth. That's the thing. It's not theoretical. Like, we are made, most of us, depending on our biology, we're, 60 to 70% water. We can't digest our own food without what we call so-called good bacteria in our GI tract. We are deeply interdependent. We are not the sovereign masters we like to think we are. And we're not the outside stewards hired to tend well this land. We are part of creation. We're dust of this earth. And that maybe is a good segue to the question about deep incarnation and qualified vegetarianism. I think I have mixed feelings about this, and I'll tell you why I have mixed feelings about it. The mixed feelings arise from the fact that Francis of Assisi was not a vegetarian. This shocks a lot of people, the patron saint of ecology. And part of that has to do with his interpretation of the gospel in the writing of the Rule of the Friars, which is, this idea of living without anything of our own requires our recognizing a radical interdependence. And so our rule says that we are to eat what's placed before us. If meat's placed before us, we eat meat. If vegetables are placed before us, we eat vegetables. So that's just to name that. I think, though, the questioner brings up a really good point. And I liked early on this language of qualified vegetarianism. The factory farming industry in many developed nations is ethically atrocious on its face because of the way we treat non-human creatures. And there's a colonial sort of pattern that plays out there that would be worth another conversation some other time. But it also exacerbates all these other kind of catastrophic things. Like it sets into motion a dominoes of ecological catastrophe, methane gas release, greenhouse gas increase, these kinds of things. The pollution of waterways from waste and so forth. I think ultimately, yeah, we especially, and again, this is a problem. This, the hashtag first world problems. It truly is a developed world problem of eating too much meat, and I think we could all do well to eat less of that. I think it becomes complicated because, unfortunately, like a lot of things, and Pope Francis names this in Laudato Si as a source of temptation or danger, which is our being numb to the kind of massiveness of the problem before us. And so that individual decisions, like my choice to refrain from eating meat, or your choice, or all of us who are on this webinar this evening's choice to not do it, would not even begin to make any kind of impact. So what does it look like to mandate that? Well, if you could get 1.2 billion Catholics to not eat meat, that would have a really significant, in fish for that matter, because that's also a lot of work, especially fish farming. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because the intuition I agree with. I think that's the right direction, but I think the answer is this is a both and. I think there are practices at the local level, the individual level, that must be done, and part of that can be that usus pauper applied to our eating practices, shopping practices, use of things. That includes meat, right? But also there has to be structural change as well. Outlawing of factory farming in the way that, that sort of thing, which would then also decrease the supply of meat, right? So that we're not eating as much of it and so forth. So there are lots of things that we can think about to respond to this. But I think, generally speaking, I agree with the spirit of the question. I just raise questions myself about what does that look like in practice?
So I know I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions. We only have 2 minutes left, but I'm going to give you two sort of general broad categories. And if you want to say a word about only one, if we only have time for one, or both. So one has to do with what you're just talking about, practices, and how, as opposed to the sinful social structures through which we harm other creatures in the rest of the natural world, how human beings might build up what Professor Michael Trey-Levin, who teaches political science here, is calling graceful social structures, such as a carbon tax or something like that, to at least work toward a repair of some of the harm done. Or a question from Lauren Hackman Brooks in Mission and Ministry about what some other spiritual practices, or how some other spiritual practices might contribute to or help foster a kinship model. Another set of questions has to do with how God, or the sacrament of God, if the earth can be seen as a sacrament of God, how that might also be seen in things like the predation that's part of the natural world or the rest of the animal kingdom, or something like the coronavirus that causes COVID-19.
Oh, yeah.
So two very broad questions. We're at time, but just wanted to throw those out before I thank everyone.
So I think that second question it's an awesome question. And I do have lots of thoughts, but for the sake of time, I'm very sorry. I'm going to pass on it. And I'm going to go back to the first question about, I like the graceful structures framing there. I think that's insightful. And I'll just say, with regard to the first part of those two general questions, That's exactly the kind of thing that Pope Francis is pointing to in chapters 5 and 6 of Laudato Si, when he talks about pragmatic response, political engagement, social action, and this is fully in keeping with the church's tradition. In fact, if we had more time, I would have gone into the structure in greater detail of Laudato Si instead of just that one slide. And what we see with the structure, the 6 chapters, is that Pope Francis is following the see, judge, act model of taking our principles of faith and putting them into action. The first 2 chapters, what's happening in the world, what resources do we have in the tradition. The middle 2 chapters are about assessing what's going on, judging, interpreting. And the last 2 chapters, 5 and 6, are about that pragmatic action, political and social engagement. So carbon taxes, social structures, these kinds of things under the heading of graceful structures, I think that's exactly right. That's very much in keeping. And Laudato Si gives us some of the language, the spiritual language, the kind of actionable language that can lead to those, to inspire, I would say, those kinds of policies and policy advocacy. And then the last point about spiritual practices, I love that question too. It follows very much from the first. So, thank you, Dr. Brown, you did a good job synthesizing these. Just 2 things. These are simple things. The kinship model invites us, in the same way that Francis of Assisi did in the Canticle and in his own sort of discourse, to be mindful of the language we use and how language functions. So we all know the power of words. We all know that words are tied to social imaginaries. And so when we degrade a community of people, when we call somebody a derogatory term, when we, et cetera, we know how that works and what that does. Similarly, the kinship model invites us to think about the language we use when we speak and when we think about our place within the broader community of creation. So to talk about, as Francis of Assisi did, that, this squirrel is my sister, this fish is my brother, to a lot of post-Enlightenment, post-Western Enlightenment thinkers, that sounds crazy. It sounds like you're, out of your mind or something. And yet, that's also profoundly true. So I'm not saying you have to go around and be like Francis of Assisi and use these terms every day, but that's one thing, just to think about how we talk about things. That's why stewardship versus kinship is so significant. The language of stewardship is a language of a job description, where the language of kin or community is a language of inherent relatability. That functions. If you think of yourself, even like I said, that exercise of reflecting on a breath, if you're outside and you're standing in grass and by a tree and you take a deep breath, remember where that oxygen came from and where your poisonous carbon dioxide is going, right? That leads me to my second and last point about spiritual practices. And it's, for the Christians among us, it's a commonplace practice of saying grace before meals. A lot of people in the Catholic tradition know the bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, yada, yada, yada. My invitation would be to think about how we frame the language we use, to thank the life that has made this meal possible. Now, you could be, depending on how comfortable you are and how much you want to draw the attention of your dining partners, you could thank, the life of the cucumber that sacrificed itself so that you might live, or, the cow that contributed to this beef that you're about to consume, or what have you. And I think there we see resonances that align with the Christian tradition and many indigenous traditions around the world that recognize that, by naming the life that has made this possible, it's not just a cute romantic caricature or poetic sort of vision. It's a profound truth of our reality. And I think it harkens back to John's gospel, where Jesus says there's no greater love than this, than to lay down your life for your friend. And is that not what we do, right? We consume other creatures, plant creatures, animal creatures, etc., so that we might live. And in a very literal sense, to Jesus's point, in this family of God's creation, the rest of creation has laid down its life for us at various points. It raises questions for us about what we do in return. So those are just little spiritual practices I would invite us to consider. There are many more, and I hope, with the launch of the center next week and all the great conversations and initiatives going on campus there, that you can do that around the university. So thank you for letting me be a part of your reflecting on this. And thank you again, Dr. Brown, Dr. Henning, and everybody there.
Thank you, Father Horan, very much for joining the Gonzaga University community and friends worldwide this evening for this wonderful lecture and conversation we've been able to have for the past few minutes. Just as a quick answer to a question that came up in the Q&A, this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the Gonzaga Mission and Ministry website, as well as I believe on the website of the new Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment once we get it all converted and posted. So again, thank you, Father Horan, on behalf of Gonzaga University as a whole, and especially the Office of Mission and Ministry, the Environmental Studies Department, the Religious Studies Department, and Catholic Studies for being with us and for sharing the gift of your wisdom and your presence. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody, and go Zags.